Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Past and Printed, the show where we take a look at a newspaper from today's date, from a randomly chosen city, in a randomly chosen year, to see what the everyday person was reading about and what was going on in their world. For our last episode of the year, our random selection algorithm has landed us in the village of Larchmont, New York, looking at the Saturday, December 27th, 1913 edition of the Larchmonter Times. And of course, as usual, I'll give you some quick facts and a brief history of Larchmont. The village of Larchmont is located in the town of Mamaroneck, which itself is located in Westchester County, all about 18 miles northeast of Manhattan. In New York State, a town is generally the default local government besides cities, but some residents have formed villages, which are an additional layer of governmental division. It's kind of complicated, but basically within a county, there are cities or towns, and towns may be further divided into villages. But the area around the village of Larchmont was inhabited by the Siwanoy people when the Dutch first arrived in 1614. In 1664, an English merchant, John Richbell, ostensibly purchased the land around Larchmont for a nominal amount of goods. This purchase was contested by another Englishman, Thomas Revell, who had apparently paid the Siwanoy more for the same land. However, Richbell's claim was upheld by New Netherland Governor Peter Stuyvesant. Later in 1664, the land fell under the control of the British, and in 1668, Richbell began encouraging other colonists to settle on his land. In 1788, the New York legislature created the town of Mamaroneck, and the village of Larchmont was incorporated in 1891 as locals demanded municipal services that the town was unable to provide. Larchmont had long been a summer retreat for rich New Yorkers, but by the early 1900s, the village had become the suburban home of many wealthy individuals who commuted to New York City for work. Many historic homes still exist in Larchmont, from the 1797 manor house of Peter J. Monroe to the Victorian-era cottages of the aforementioned high-income New Yorkers. To this day, Larchmont remains one of the wealthiest places in the country, with a median household income of nearly $200,000 a year. As of the 1910 census, the population of Larchmont was 1,958, and as of 2020, the village was home to 6,630 people. And in December of 1913, the editor and proprietor of the Larchmonter Times was George P. Forbes. A one-year subscription cost $2, or about $65.45 in 2025, and a single issue cost 5 cents, or about $1.62 these days. And with that, let's hop into the Saturday, December 27th, 1913 edition of the Larchmonter Times. The first major story on the first page is titled, Mr. Macy Tells of Plans. Superintendent of the Poor elect will make special study of pauperism. So, as you may have guessed, this doesn't have anything to do with the Macy's department store, other than that this Mr. Macy is a very distant relative of Macy's founder Roland H. Macy. No, this article is a summary of a speech given by Valentine Everett Macy, better known as V. Everett Macy, who was an industrialist and philanthropist who had recently been elected as the Westchester County Commissioner of Charities and Corrections, referred to here as Superintendent of the Poor. Basically, Commissioner Macy is laying out his policy and strategy for his upcoming term. Despite his current status as a newly elected official, Mr. Macy starts out his speech by declaring that the position should never have been a political office in the first place. He actually kind of rails against the historical system of these types of positions being seen as a way to award political party loyalists, and seems to even dislike the idea of it being an elected position at all. He basically argues that A, the superintendent's salary is sufficient to attract a professional with significant administrative experience, and B, at the very least, the term should be greater than 3 years, as welfare policy requires long-term planning and data collection, which is hard to sustain with constant partisan turnover. He does, however, speak well of his predecessor, who, despite being a shopkeeper at the time of his appointment, was, quote, an able and conscientious man who devoted all his time to his duties, unquote. He does go on to offer an extensive critique of the overall welfare system of Westchester County, highlighting overcrowded, neglected, and outdated poorhouses and almshouses, where children, the mentally ill, elderly, and able-bodied poor were all thrown together in the same facilities despite having vastly different needs. Macy also points out that currently these institutions are largely independent from each other with no unified policy, and that the superintendent has no control or even real knowledge of who is being admitted to these facilities, and therefore how their situations might be improved, allowing them to be lifted out of poverty. In fact, an overarching theme of his speech is a rejection of the idea that poverty is a moral failing and that the prevention of poverty in the first place is, in fact, a more effective strategy than simply trying to manage it after the fact by institutionalizing the destitute. To Macy, this is especially true for children and families who frequently, at least in Westchester County apparently, find themselves in poverty due to workplace injury or parental illness or death, namely of the male parent, who generally would have been the sole breadwinner. While he does mention widows' pension funds as a means of preventing families from being simply shunted into the poorhouse, he also advocates for measures such as the Workmen's Compensation Law that had recently been passed in New York, and for strengthening workplace safety regulations as a way of passing some of the financial responsibility, quote, on the industry rather than on the government, unquote. Another large portion of Superintendent Macy's speech was related to the aforementioned lack of knowledge about the people in the county's poorhouses and what their actual situations were. To that end, the new superintendent plans to conduct studies on the causes of poverty in Westchester County, referred to in the speech as pauperism. He does seem to have some suspicions and assumptions already, and does have some strategies in mind if his hypotheses turn out to be correct. For example, if he finds that many of the county's poor have little to no formal education and no trade skills other than a specific factory job, he intends to fund what he calls industrial schools, or I think what we would refer to as trade schools, to enable the children of the poor to take up skilled professions rather than simply toil their lives away in factories. He also attempts to head off critics by pointing out that although these schools may cost more than the current almshouses right now, in the long term they will eventually cost less by reducing the number of destitute in the county. He concludes his speech by saying, quote, little can be accomplished in these complex, far-reaching, and fundamental social problems unless intelligent public interest and wise sympathy is aroused, and when the county institutions are no longer the prey of party spoilsmen, unquote. So yeah, quite the progressive view of his office for the time, and honestly, while not perfect, because he does suggest that poorhouses should simply grow their own food instead of having the government buy it for them, and he suggests studying which, quote, countries and races make up the foreign poor, unquote. His views would be considered quite modern and even progressive by today's standards for some people, which frankly is a condemnation of our current socio-political climate if you ask me, and if you didn't ask me, well, it's my show, I can say what I like. Continuing on, the Larchmont Village trustees have approved a 5-cent trolley fare between Larchmont and New Rochelle, or about $1.62 in 2025 dollars. The New Rochelle Common Council has adopted a similar resolution. There is a letter written by a Clarence DeWitt Rogers to the Larchmont Board of Trustees on behalf of a Mr. P.H. Collins. It appears that Mr. Collins is licensed by the trustees to remove ashes and garbage in the village, so basically he operates a waste removal service. As a condition of this license, Mr. Collins was required by the health board to haul waste using enclosed iron carts, which he was required to pay for himself, as well as paying a surety company bond, or basically money paid to ensure that Collins would fulfill his waste removal contract and follow all of the laws and regulations relating to that service. However, it appears that another licensed waste remover, a Mr. J.B. Jubb, has been performing his removals in, quote, a common open cart with practically no appliance for preventing ashes, garbage, and leakage therefrom from getting upon the streets, unquote. Now, argues Rogers, either through Jubb's ignorance or disregard for regulations, not only does Collins have less business thanks to a competitor, that competitor is not complying by the same regulations as Mr. Collins, and presumably hasn't had to assume the same expenses. Rogers believes this constitutes a breach of contract on behalf of the village, and that unless the situation is remedied, Collins will be forced to surrender his license, demand a return of the surety bond, and cease business in the village, which will then presumably be served only by Jubb and his leaky garbage cart. The New Rochelle fundraising campaign has continued to collect, quote, contributions and subscriptions, unquote, now accounting for $100,025, or about $3.24 million in 2025. Westchester County District Attorney Frederick E. Weeks has announced his final list of subordinates, including William J. Fallon of Mamaroneck, who will take on the role of First Assistant District Attorney. Lawyer Fallon is an honor graduate of Fordham University and Fordham Law School. Go Rams! After graduating and passing the bar in 1909, he immediately went to work at the firm of Fallon and Smith in White Plains and currently serves as the village attorney of Mamaroneck Village. Quote, he is considered one of the best of the rising young attorneys in the county, where clever attorneys are the rule, and he has won this place by his ability, unquote. Additionally, current White Plains Police Judge Walter A. Ferris has been appointed Second Assistant District Attorney. Ernest E. Carpenter of White Plains has earned the position of Grand Jury Stenographer, and John Wheatley of Yonkers has been reappointed as Law Clerk. In another published letter, Pennsylvania Congressman Warren Worth Bailey implores Larchmont Postmaster John Maddock Jr. to support his bill advocating for, quote, free mail delivery, unquote, to all villages and towns in the country with a population greater than 1,000 people, and allocating at least $10 million, or about $324 million in 2025, to pay for the required mail carriers. To provide some context, free mail delivery refers basically to home delivery, not that people shouldn't pay for postage at all. Before free delivery, people either had to go to the post office themselves or pay an individual fee for post to be delivered to their home. Although the U.S. Postal Service had authorized home delivery in cities starting in 1863, communities had to meet certain qualifying agreements, so mailboxes, standardized street addresses, streets suitable for carrying mail, etc. And by 1900, only about 800 cities had qualified, which was a lot for the time, but obviously not by modern standards. And although the Rural Free Delivery, or RFD system, was established in 1902, this was explicitly for rural homes, so suburban communities like Larchmont wouldn't have qualified for free delivery under that system either. I don't actually know when Larchmont received free delivery authorization, but apparently other communities in the area seem to have been authorized during the 1910s, 1920s, so I would imagine it was similar for Larchmont. There are several letters responding to a letter received in the December 20th edition of the paper, in which, quote, a fireman gardener, unquote, was inquiring why the Larchmont Fire Company drove their truck across the lawn of a Mr. Clark, quote, plowing it up as they did, unquote. The chief engineer of the fire department, George S. Towle, responds that this person can either telephone Mr. Clark or the fire department to find out why the truck was driven through the yard, and, quote, he need not divulge his name, unquote. However, another firefighter actually provides the answer, writing that the wind was driving sparks towards a large greenhouse and other wooden buildings and had already set some of the grass on fire near those buildings. In order to access the area, it was necessary to drive through Mr. Clark's yard as there was no other roadway. The firefighter also muses that perhaps the letter writer, quote, in the interests of his profession, believes a strip of grass more valuable than wooden buildings in danger of being burned and a greenhouse in danger of being cracked by heat, unquote. There's also a letter voicing the writer's support for the new garbage remover, John Jubb, mostly because his fee is much lower than the existing fees being paid. They don't mention Mr. Collins by name, but presumably he was the only other garbage remover up until this point. Although, if the earlier letter is to be believed, Mr. Jubb's fees may be so much less simply because he doesn't bother complying with the health board regulations. 2 yachting prizes won by the Larchmont-based sloop Wild Time were stolen from the office of its owner, Alfred Hennon Morris, at 68 Broad Street in New York City. According to Mrs. Morris, the family is offering a cash reward for the return of the prizes. That is the Commodore's Cup and the Larchmont Season Cup. Apparently, the thief gained access to Mr. Morris's office by climbing over a transom. The Larchmont Fire Company will be holding a beefsteak dinner on Saturday, January 17th, and by all indications, it will surpass all previous iterations. So, to give some context, beefsteak dinners were a particular style of banquet where beef was served in large quantities, basically as finger food. So you'd have all these tables just piled high with slices of meat, and the attendees, pretty much all men, would just drink beer and eat a bunch of steak with their bare hands. These were very much a working class or even middle class male event, usually centered around political fundraising or, in this case, fundraising for the local fire department. This particular beefsteak dinner will be held in the Jungle Room at Healy's, located at 66th Street and Columbus Circle in Manhattan. The final column on page 1 gives a summary of the Christmas program that was held at the Chatsworth Avenue Public School on Friday, December 19th, which was a combination of songs and recitals given by the students, and a magic lantern show featuring the Larchmont Public Gardens. There's a list of songs and I guess probably like short stories or poems recited by the students. I won't read them all, but some of the recitations include Santa Claus's Secret, performed by Barbara Hutchins, Washington's Christmas Gift, performed by William Acton, and The Turkey's Lament, performed by Gwendolyn Feehan. The County Board of Supervisors has set January 5th, 1914, as the date for a hearing on a new County Tax Act. Mostly, the act apparently simplifies the methods for assessment and taxation, and provides for the sale of land in lieu of unpaid taxes, and the giving of tax leases. The Columbia University Musical Club will give their annual concert for the benefit of St. John's Church on Friday, January 16th at 8:30 p.m. at the Parish House. And finally, Miss Margaret Kistinger was awarded the automobile in the contest at Lowe's Theater in New Rochelle on Wednesday, December 17th. Quote, "The machine was the property of the New Rochelle Elks," unquote. It doesn't say what the contest was, but, congrats to Miss Kistinger. And that's going to do it for page 1 of the Larchmonter Times, so let's sail on over to page 2. And the majority of page 2 is taken up by either advertisements or court summons. Though in an interesting little detail, the court summons are mostly for the Supreme Court of Westchester County, which may sound weird, but in New York State, the term Supreme Court actually refers to the trial court rather than the court of last resort, like the U.S. Supreme Court or the state Supreme Court in, I think, every other state. I'm not going to read through the summonses, though, because the vast majority simply state the parties to the case, who needs to show up, and when and where they need to show up. And many of them are related to the distribution of property from estates of deceased persons. There are, however, some editorial pieces on the page, including one reprinted from the Yonkers Herald titled A Triple County Problem. Although the name is a little misleading, the piece starts out by stating that several governmental offices are seeking new facilities. The state wants a new penitentiary, the new superintendent of the poor, our friend V. Everett Macy, wants a new county almshouse and hospital, the county board of supervisors wants a new tuberculosis hospital, and the county judge wants a new county penitentiary. Apparently, County Judge Platt has suggested constructing the new almshouse and county penitentiary on the same portion of land, preferably in one of the towns in the northern portion of the county where there is more open space. His idea is that prisoners serving a year or less could be sent to this new county penitentiary instead of sending them to Blackwell's Island in New York City, now Roosevelt Island, which would presumably save the county some money. Also, the county penitentiary would have an attached farm where the prisoners would work, and this was seen as an extremely progressive advancement in the development of correctional facilities. To quote the article, "The old days of the dungeon are passing. Progress and civilization do not countenance the cooping up of human beings as is done with wild or savage animals in a zoo, unquote. They also note that recent studies show that the majority of prisoners are quote-unquote redeemable, and that, quote, open air, sunshine for the well-behaved, and work for all who are able to keep them from virtually rotting in prison, mentally, physically, and morally, are required more and more, unquote. Relating to the earlier mentioned bill advocating for free mail delivery, the Times encourages all Larchmont citizens to write to Congressman Benjamin I. Taylor to implore him to support the Bailey Bill, House Resolution 8947. There's also an announcement that Mrs. Lancaster Morgan, formerly of Larchmont, gave a tea dance at her home at 175 West 58th Street in Manhattan for her daughter, Miss Helen Ridgely Morgan, who will not come out to society until next winter. It's noted that the decorations were Christmas greens of holly and mistletoe, and there was music throughout the afternoon. Mrs. George E. Ide and Mrs. Edward Wilkins presided at the tea table. The guests included, quote, a few of the older girls and men, but the majority of the guests were college boys home for the holidays, and the younger girls, there were about 200 guests, unquote. If you're not a fan of HBO's The Gilded Age or that one episode of The Simpsons with Rodney Dangerfield, you might not be familiar with the concept of coming out to society.
Larry, you must meet our daughter, the debutante. She came out last spring.
Whoa, put her back in. She's not done yet.
Now, that reaction may seem harsh, but traditionally young women came out during the winter social season, so that lady committed a bit of a faux pas herself. Basically, in upper and upper middle class families, coming out meant that a young woman was being formally introduced to adult social life. Essentially, for the purposes of marriage and social status, she was now considered an adult, and though the exact age would vary by family, this was usually done in the late teens or early 20s. And by that I mean the age of the person, not the decades, although the decades too. I think you know what I mean. But this meant that she would now be invited to adult social events, could be publicly courted by romantic suitors, and would be eligible for marriage. So in this context, the tea dance was essentially a rehearsal for her official debut to society, a soft launch, if you will. Thus, most of the guests being college-age boys and teenage girls, which certainly seems strange at first reading, but when they say younger girls, what they mean is young women who haven't been debuted to society yet. So while it could include girls as young as 16, which would be, a little off-putting, it would generally include 17, 18, even 20-year-olds who hadn't come out to society yet. And the young men, at least in these upper class and upper middle class circles, were very much expected to finish their education and begin their professions before even courting someone for marriage. So events like this were more to introduce these young men to women that they might want to pursue for marriage in a few years' time. And that's, of course, not to excuse any significant age gaps that did occur back then, but I wanted to clarify that, especially by 1913, this kind of event would have generally been like 17, 18, 19-year-old girls or women socializing with men, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 years older than them in a supervised setting with the intention that they might get romantically involved a couple or more years down the road. But moving on from social news, Daniel A. Linehan, formerly of the Larchmont Electric Company, wishes to announce that he has opened an office in the Malmquist building on the Boston Post Road, where he will be pleased to receive orders for all kinds of electrical work. Speaking of work, bids are wanted by the village of Larchmont for a 6-month contract from January to July 1st, 1914, to supply hay, straw, oats, bran, oil, rock salt, and coal to be delivered to the village hall and fire headquarters. Bids will be received up to January 5th, 1914. And finally, for the accommodation of people wishing to participate in New Year's Eve festivities in New York City, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, in accordance with its custom of previous years, will operate a special train on January 1st. It will leave Grand Central Terminal at 1:31 a.m., stopping at 125th Street and all stops from Mount Vernon to Stamford. And with that, we've reached the end of page 2, and we'll keep on rolling on to page 3. If you can believe it, page 3 contains even more advertisements than page 2, including one for our old friend John Jubb, who claims that he is ready to move your garbage and ashes at reasonable rates. There is, however, a section of, quote, items of interest, which include that chicken coop thieves have been operating in Larchmont. Pete Nelson complains of the loss of a prize chicken being stolen last Friday night and warns all other owners of chickens to see to it that their coops are securely locked at night. The annual meeting of the Horseshoe Harbor Club will take place on Monday, January 12th. Officers for the ensuing year will be elected at that time. There will be a dinner and dance at the Larchmont Yacht Club on New Year's Eve. Teachers in the local schools left on Tuesday, December 23rd for their homes in different parts of the state for the Christmas holidays. School will reopen on Tuesday, January 6th. Residents of Larchmont Gardens have formed an association and will cooperate with the Woods of Larchmont Association in the interest of both developments. And finally, the sum of $57,997.23, or about $1.88 million in 2025, is the Village of Mamaronec's share of the expense for brick paving the Boston Post Road, according to figures received from the State Highway Department. There's also a few, quote, personal mentions. Mr. and Mrs. A. Brian Alley are at The Carolina in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Mr. and Mrs. Leon N. Gillette and Son are in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Village Attorney Herbert W. Smith is in Montreal, Canada. And Francis Cowan of Forest Park is in St. Louis on business. And then there's some kind of miscellaneous local news snippets, such as that during the New Year's week, Madame Bertha Kalich will play at the Royal Theatre, 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the Bronx, the entire production of the comedy Rachel, as produced originally at the Knickerbocker Theatre. Mr. Sidney Booth of Larchmont is retained as Madame Kalich's leading man. And the chemical auto fire apparatus of Fire Company No. 2, in charge of Chief Engineer George S. Towell, and several officials of the fire department participated in the parade in New Rochelle last Saturday night. There's also an ad for an apartment to rent, and I love looking at these to see kind of the difference in home prices between then and now. So for 5 rooms in a 2-family home, it's $14. Contact Frederick P. Bohm, Post Road, Larchmont. It doesn't say if that's $14 per week or per month, but $14 is about $454 in 2025, so even if it is per week, that's still a little over $1,800 a month in $2025. And your average 1-bedroom apartment in Larchmont is currently going for around $2,300 a month, so there you go. And with that lesson in the rates of housing inflation, we finish up with page 3 and move on to our 4th and final page. So once again, quite a few ads, but some interesting news pieces as well. First, there are the terms for the County Court of Westchester for 1914. For the trial of issues at which a petite jury will be required to attend, court will be held on the 2nd Monday of January, the 3rd Monday of February, 1st Monday of March, 1st Monday of May, 2nd Monday of September, 3rd Monday of October, and 4th Monday of November. Grand juries will be called for the January, April, September, and October terms. All other cases, 1st and 3rd Fridays of each month, except August. There is also an account of the trap shooting performance of Ralph K. Spots, 13-year-old son of Eastern amateur trap shooting champion Ralph L. Spots. Wonder if his son was Ralph J. It appears that young Spots won 5 of the 8 prize matches at the Larchmont Yacht Club on Saturday, December 21st. There is a type of notice that I've never seen before in one of these papers, which is advising readers of the telephone number for the fire headquarters, number 252, by the way, and reminding them that when calling, they need to say which fire district they're located in, which can be found on a card, which they should have in their house. And finally, there is a section titled Women's Suffrage. We are informed that the Larchmonter Times has agreed to dedicate a certain amount of space weekly to the cause of women's suffrage, with members of the local Equal Franchise Society providing the articles, which frankly is kind of a pleasant surprise. You certainly couldn't count on newspapers in this time period to be champions for socially progressive causes, but it does appear the Larchmonter Times has at least decided to give a voice to the women seeking equal representation. The first portion of this section is titled Women Make Gains in the Business World, and quotes the Baltimore Sun in saying that women's place may be in the home, but judging from recent statistics, she seems to have deliberately ignored the fact, for there are 239,077 stenographers, 327,635 teachers and professors, 481,159 in various trades, 770,055 engaged in agricultural pursuits, 7,300 physicians and surgeons, 7,395 clergy, 2,193 journalists, 1,037 architects, designers, and draftswomen, 1,010 lawyers, and 429,497 women in various professions. And while this doesn't seem that impressive today, for women at the time, it probably would have been very encouraging, considering that the vast majority of women did not have professions and rarely worked for pay after marriage, and very few careers were even considered suitable for any woman. So to see that any women at all were working as lawyers, doctors, architects, journalists would have been seen as progress. Then the next section is a short piece which makes a few points about women's suffrage, and I'll just read them all. They say, quote, "If women's suffrage is the failure the anti-suffragists say it is in California, why don't they wipe it out of the Constitution? They have the referendum in the state and could easily do it," unquote. And they're referring to the fact that women achieved the right to vote in California in 1911 in a statewide referendum. They go on to say, "If women's suffrage is a failure in Australia, would the Australian Parliament, after 11 years' experience, pass a unanimous resolution declaring it to be a success and then call on the English Parliament to enfranchise English women?" I'll note that South Australia granted voting rights to women in 1894, and women were granted federal voting rights in 1902, and the final state, Victoria, finally allowed women to vote in state elections in 1908. It should also be noted, though, that Indigenous Australians were excluded from all of these acts, and weren't allowed to vote without restriction in federal elections until 1962, and the last restriction on Indigenous voting rights were lifted in Queensland in 1966. And finally, the writer says, "If at the September primaries in the great city of New York, with a population of nearly 5 million, only 144,660 men voted, what right have men to demand that women prove the majority of women want to vote before suffrage shall be extended to women?" Solid point, no notes. And that is the end of the women's suffrage section, and with that we come to the end of the Saturday, December 27th, 1913 edition of the Larchmonter Times from Larchmont, New York. So, while many of these small-town newspapers have a tendency to lean on wire services and other papers for most of their content, I was pleased to see that most of the material in the Larchmonter Times was village and county news, and most pieces that were lifted from other publications were directly related to business in the village. And sure, that does mean that there wasn't quite as much written content as in some other 4-page papers, but sometimes it's about quality, not quantity. So I hope you found that interesting as well, and if you did, please consider subscribing on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or whatever platform you're listening on. I am going to be taking about a month and a half off to try and get some of the older episodes up on YouTube and get some of my production processes smoothed out for season 2, but I really want to thank everyone who's listened in over the past year. I've had a lot of fun getting this show up and running. I can't wait to dive into our next batch of newspapers, and if you're looking for some fun, don't forget to reserve your table at Wolf's Inn for New Year's Eve. A fine orchestra, excellent dancing, and good eating. Telephone Larchmont 497. Thanks again for listening to Past in Printed. I've been your host, Lloyd. I hope you have a happy new year, and that your next news is all good news.